Då får jag hälsa er välkomna till Kallvattenkuren och säsongens sista föreläsning. Vi återkommer sen i vår igen, så jag hoppas att ni kommer allihopa. Utrymningsvägar vet ni, där borta och där ni kom. Och ni som är där hemma, ni får lösa det här på egen hand om larmen går. Kan inte hjälpa er där. Idag ska vi lyssna på Brandon Foley som är forskare på institutionen för institutionen för arkeologi och antik historia. Och Brandon har umgåtts mer med Gripsunden och föremålen än de flesta, skulle jag nog vilja säga. Det är ju flera som har dykt på vraket såklart. Men idag får ni passa på att ställa alla frågor ni har, så ska vi få en liten uppdatering om vad vi vet så här långt. Föreläsningen hålls på engelska, så jag hoppas att inte det kommer som en överraskning nu för er. Sen när vi ställer frågor efteråt, så är det så att när vi ställer frågan på svenskan så kan jag hjälpa till att översätta. Och Brandon han smyg förstår lite grann. Så prata inte en skit sådär, då förstår jag. Och jag kan också säga det att om man går in och lyssnar på det här efteråt på YouTube så går det faktiskt att välja textning och välja språk. Så då kan ni få det på hebreiska, arabiska, vad ni nu vill ha det på. Vad som helst. Det kan bli lite knasigt såklart, det blir nästan lite roligt, men det blir ju i alla fall begripbart. Så varsågod, Brandon.
Ja, tack så mycket. Is that too loud? Seems very loud to me. It's a little loud. Yeah. I don't want you to have to listen to me breathe. How's that? That's better, I think, yeah? A little more? Yeah. Okay. Well, I have about 45 minutes of slides to show you and video, a little discussion about Gripsholmen, which I think is among the most important archaeological sites underwater ever discovered anywhere in the world. I've looked at something upwards of 50, 60, maybe more ancient shipwrecks in the Mediterranean all over the world, and nothing really comes close to Gripsholmen. Maybe one or two other sites, that's it. And the reason it's so important is not just because it's the ship of King Hans, not just because it's the exact same kind of ship that Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus and the other great explorers of the late 15th century and early 16th century used to, in effect, conquer the entire world. But it's important because Hans was on board the ship as it sailed to Kalmar, where he was trying to fulfill his ambition of creating a greater Nordic state, unifying, reunifying the states that had belonged to the Kalmar Union from Margaret I. And if Hans had been successful, then I think certainly that greater Nordic kingdom would have been a peer competitor to the Tudor kings in England, and maybe even competitors to the rulers in the Low Countries, maybe even France, Spain, and Portugal. It would have been a totally different world if Hans had been successful in June of 1495. We're going to talk about some of the markers of the elite. And Gripsholmen really is that lens. It's a window into the upper stratum of society in the late medieval period. But really, it's a glimpse into how we construct our own societies, our own cultures, all over the world throughout time. Gripsholmen's a really good example of how we do that. And some of the things that were used, physical things that were used in the late medieval period are ships and castles. If you're powerful, you have a ship, you have more than one ship, you certainly have a castle or more than one castles. Artillery on the ships is another marker of wealth and of power. Not everyone could afford it. Not everyone could have this combination of the new ship style that Gripsholmen represents and this new technology of gunpowder weapons on ships. Clothing is another thing that's really important. Still today, but more so even in the late medieval period. So we expect that we're going to find textiles on the wreck at some point. We haven't found any yet. We had one false alarm, which I'll show you in a few slides from now. But clothing's extremely important. Money, cash money. We find coins on the wreck, and I'm going to hand around a couple of examples of coins, just like the ones we found on the wreck, so you can look at it. We're seeing in the late 15th century the shift from a barter economy, a specie economy, to a cash economy. And Hans is one of the key players in that. In his Hansfestning, he has to establish mints in Norway. He has to establish new mints in Denmark. And part of the reason he has to do that is he needs money. He needs hard money to pay mercenaries to fight the Swedes. Other things that are markers of the nobility in the medieval world are hunting and gaming. We've got physical examples of that and some texts also from primary sources relating to Gribshunden. And then artwork. If you're wealthy, if you're powerful, you'll have quite an ornate visual display in your home, in your clothes, and everywhere. And then finally, foods and food ways. The way you eat, the things that you eat, all of this is what constructs the nobility in the medieval world. It still are the harbingers, the markers today of upper class society. One of the ways we're thinking about Gribshunden is comparing it directly to castles. So Glimmingehus in Skåne is one prime example of a castle that's roughly contemporary, built 1499, and built by Jens Holgersson Ulfstand, who was one of Hans's right-hand men. In fact, Gribshunden sails to Gotland in 1486, 87, where Hans emplaces Jens Holgersson in Visby Castle to take over Gotland from a Swedish-Danish nobleman who's not quite loyal to Hans. So Glimmingehus, with its ship depiction in the Lord's Chamber, is really, really close to Gribshunden, and Jens Holgersson becomes admiral of the Danish fleet in a few years' time. Now, it's really interesting to compare the ships to the castles because they're about the same size. They're really not huge castles, and the ships aren't massive either, but the living space aboard, it's about equal. And not just in Glimmingehus, but in the other Danish castles too. For instance, Nyborg, where Hans spends a lot of time. Nyborg Castle, here it is after some additions. I was there just a month and a half ago. But in the late 15th century, the living space, the area within Nyborg Castle wasn't much bigger than Gribshunden itself. And given the very few fireplaces and heating sources in Nyborg, it was probably just as dark, just as wet, and just as cold as being on board a ship. So what did Gribshunden look like? We have some examples. I don't know how washed out that one there on the right is. This one here on the left is a wall painting in a church, Snargate Church in England. And it was painted in the late 1480s, early 1490s, and it almost certainly represents King Henry VII's great ship, Regent. Now, Regent's a really impressive vessel, probably twice the size of Gribshunden at about 600 tons when built, but it carried 181 serpentine guns, the same kinds of guns as we find on Gribshunden. So I think Gribshunden is probably more like the picture on the right, a little bit smaller, but you see that they both have 4 masts. We think Gribshunden had 3, but we're not sure of that yet. Probably not top mast, just the single mast on the main mast, and then carrying guns, serpentine guns along the outside of it. But this is the technology that dominates the planet after 1495. So the ship itself was built in the Low Countries from timber cut in the Ardennes region in what's Belgium or France today. And it may be a proxy for these great ships of discovery, which we'll probably never find because they sank in the world ocean system where the wood borers, which is a topic I'll come back to, live. So all of the wood gets eaten away. There are only a couple of examples of ships that are about contemporary with Gribshunden, and they're really quite sparse, the remains there. So there's one from one of Vasco da Gama's fleet from 1502 that sank in Oman. 2 ships actually went down together. But they were salvaged soon after, and then the wood all went away. So Gribshunden really gives us about the only look into this terrific technology. And she was widely traveled. So built down there, probably near Rotterdam, around 1485. We found a letter just the other day in primary sources that show that King Hans is on board our Kravel off of Karlsund there, which was Norway at the time, now is right near Gothenburg. And then he's in Bergen in 1486 on board the ship. We have letters that he wrote when he was sailing that way, and then in Gotland. And I have this sneaking suspicion that he actually sent his uncle, Duke Gerhard, with Gribshunden to support the new king, James IV, in 1488. James IV was his nephew. Hans's younger sister, Margaret, was married to James III when she was 13 years old. But there's this gap in the records. We don't see Gribshunden between 1487 and about 1490, and I think it's possible that Gribshunden is the ship that Duke Gerhard takes over to support James IV. So widely traveling around the North Atlantic, around the North Sea, and throughout the Baltic. So I say we compare Gribshunden to castles. Well, we compare it not just in terms of its military power, but all of the functions that a land castle serves, we see Hans using Gribshunden for. So administrative, economic, cultural, and social, all of these aspects of a land castle we see with Gribshunden too. So one of those unique things, one of those special things that the elite does is writing in the medieval world. And so we have letters that Hans or his scribe wrote, but at least Hans signed, from the decks of Gribshunden. So his scribe traveled with him and his chancellery. His boxes of documents, all of the administrative needs of the realm go with him on board the ship. We've actually found physical remains, artifacts relating to this. So a small ceramic pot that very well may be an ink pot. It could be something else, but that's one interpretation. And then this other tool, which had us mystified for a while until we contacted some experts at Princeton University at the Institute for Advanced Study who study scribes and their practices in the medieval world. And what we think this is an ink blotter. Probably one of the only ones that survived from the medieval world. So it's wooden, it's small. We have found a handle just like this one, and it's probably covered in, it may be deer hide. So when you're writing with your quill on your parchment, you need to blot that ink so that it doesn't smear. And we think that's what this is. Where did it go? Uh-oh. Ah, there we are. Okay. Let's just go back. Yeah. So quite interesting. And it raises the possibility that we may actually find written documents. We may find chancellery chests. It's possible. Who knows? So Hans, in the summer of 1495, sets off for Kalmar, where he's going to meet Sten Sture, the Swedish regent. He has with him the entire Danish council, the entire Norwegian council, including the bishops, all of the high clergy, and most of the noblemen. And they're going for 5 or 6 weeks to Kalmar. And they've done this before. They go to Norway for summers at a time. And we don't have any images of what Hans was doing there, but possibly it's sort of like what Henry VIII does not too long after, just 30 years later, when he sails across the Channel to meet Francis, the King of France, in this famous thing called the meeting on the Field of the Cloth of Gold. So here's Henry in those wonderful clothes with the horses, with his whole retinue, and they set up these tents. They have wrestling matches, Henry and King Francis. Francis wins, by the way. And they're there for weeks to establish these peace treaties. There's feasting, there's all of the tournaments, there's all of the gaming, everything you would expect. So maybe this is something similar to what Hans was expecting when he got to Kalmar. But in the end, it doesn't quite go that way. So here's an actual photograph from 1495 of the ship. We think this is really what Gribshunden would have looked like in June 1495. It sank in about 10 meters of water, maybe 11 at the time. So the masts and the rigging certainly would have been standing up proud of the water surface, and probably the stern castle and forecastle too, which were really quite high on ships of this style. So easy to salvage is the thing. With all of the finery on board, with all of the wealth, all of the things that Hans packed into the ship to try to impress the Swedes, you can imagine that there would be a lot of pressure to try to get the good stuff back. So what we see on Gribshunden is disruption, particularly in the stern section where we've been excavating, where deck beams are moved, there's no deck planking left anywhere on the ship. It's probably because of not just salvage in 1495, but ongoing salvage and other interference since then. So what's the ship look like now? Well, here's a photogrammetric model. That white rectangle is the construction scaffolding that we put up to delineate our excavation trench. Nicholas Erickson says it looks like an explosion happened in a lumber yard, which is probably about right. Here's a diver for scale, but you can still see the outline of the hull. It's tilting, it's listing to starboard about 27 degrees. but there's still a whole depth of hold there, maybe 2 meters even, from the first deck down to the keel. So there's a lot of ship there, and underneath these deck beams, we think it's probably pretty well undisturbed. So there's a huge amount of archaeological material there. Okay, flash ahead a little bit. Here's the figurehead, which came up in 2015. Here's a 3D print at 1:10 scale. I can pass that around. You can see the notches in that. So it's actually a structural element in addition to the decorative object. And so why is the ship called Griffin or Gribshunden? Well, of course, we all know that the emblem of Malmo is the griffin. Eric of Pommern, Eric of Pomerania, established this heraldic symbol for Malmo in 1437. So it's quite possible that the ship was named Griffin, Grip, or Gribshunden, because of this connection to one of the most important cities in the entire Danish realm. At the time, Malmo's got a population of about 5,000. Copenhagen has a population of about 5,000. So these are two cities on either side of Øresund that are really quite important. So maybe that's where the name comes from. But the figurehead doesn't really look like a griffin. It's got this sort of dragon-like thing eating a screaming figure, eating a screaming man. That's actually a motif that's kind of common. And these aquamaniles, these sort of water pitchers that you use to wash your hands for religious ceremonies, from the same area where we think the ship was built, from the River Meuse Valley in Belgium, from northern Germany, we see these medieval icons, really, of the same kind of thing, the sort of dragon-like figure eating the screaming man. So what's it like to work on the site, to try to pull information from it? Well, the number one thing is we have to see what we're doing. So we try to maintain good visibility. We try to have powerful lights down there, so even in the gloom, we can actually see the stuff that we're touching, the stuff that we're digging up. We do artifact recovery by hand. When we're using the dredge, we put a catch bag over the end of the effluent so we can get very small things that we may miss, even with the good lighting. And then we sort that on deck. We sift through it very, very careful to see what we're missing, which is actually really important because even if you're the most conscientious excavator in the world, stuff still goes up the dredge because you just can't see it that well. Here is a site plan of the wreck site. So that photogrammetric model, we had an illustrator take that model and sketch everything in, and she even replaced the gun beds, the artillery gun beds that were recovered back in 2002. We had her put them back in their original positions. Now, the elements that are colored in red are the things that we think are the very key elements of the ship. If we look at these, if we study these, we can tell how the ship looked, how big it was, how it was arranged, what the castles were like. So we 3D model these things underwater, the big ones. This is the rudder. This is the rudder. It's in 3 pieces, so I can carry it around, but it tends to fall apart. It's a little floppy. When we started 3D printing elements from the wreck, we thought 1:10 scale would be about right for the guns, because that seemed about right. Well, the rudder's 6.5 meters tall. So it's going to be a very big Lego kit when we finally get it all together. But I won't pass this around because it's so floppy. But the information we get from this is really quite extensive. So we know by looking at the angle down here, don't worry about that, it's made of nylon, it bounces. We can tell by the angle here, where it meets the keel, what the cant of the stern post was. So that gives us the overhang if we project that angle up. So we can tell how big the stern castle was, how much space the king and his friends had back there. It also tells us sort of what the waterline depth was the hull. So we know that the ship was probably drawing something like 4 meters of water. And then when we get into the helm piece, the tiller piece, we put this on the top. It gives us an idea of how big the steerage room was in the stern, which again may be the biggest room in the back of the ship. It may be where Hans, when they were in port or at anchor, would take apart the tiller piece, and that would be sort of the great hall on board the ship. So all of this stuff adds up. It helps us reconstruct the castle at sea. Here's that tiller. This is now undergoing conservation, and it'll be at Blekinge Museum, we think, soon. Yeah? So we recovered that, along with one of the artillery beds and a hull plank from a section of the hull plank from the very far stern, very far down low, again, to get that angle. And this is another plank that we think was either for the capstan or for a pump. So some of the things we modeled underwater, some of the things we brought back to land, modeled, and then put back on the wreck site. And some of them, like the gun bed and the helm element, we conserved, and they'll be on exhibition. But there's also science involved. So that tiller, the helm piece, we wanted to find out if this was a repair or if it came with the ship originally. So here's Anton Hansen, a dendrochronologist, a tree ring expert from Lund University, drilling in and getting a core sample. And there it is. You can actually see the tree rings in this. And when he did the analysis with Hans Linderson, they found that the wood was cut in the exact same place as the hull timber was. So it comes from the River Meuse Valley, cut around 1482, 83, that winter. So it's an original piece that came with the ship. And then, of course, we 3D model it, not just with photogrammetry, but with structured light scanning. And that's what gives us the ability to make these 3D models. And when we take it up, here's Mikkel Thompson from Viking Ship Museum, trying to figure out what all the holes are. Where were the fasteners in this thing? How did it actually attach to the rudder? All of this information you really can't get underwater. It's much easier when you bring things up. And then we modeled all of them. Here's a knee. We thought if we model as many of the knees as we can, it'll give us some information about how many decks there were on the ship. So the problem is there are lodging knees and there are deck knees and there are all kinds of knees. So kind of figuring out the jigsaw puzzle without the picture on the cover of the box is a little bit hard, but that's where the magic comes in for the archaeology. We're putting all this together and trying to get the entire ship reassembled. Other elements that we modeled include the stem piece, again about 6.5 meters long. It's got this big flat scarf joint here where it met another element before it plugs into the keel itself. So now figuring out what that angle is tells us about the forecastle, how much space there was up there for the men. We've got the beginnings of a midship section there in the white, and there at the back you've got the model from the keel up to some of the standing timbers at the very aft end of the ship, and then that tall rudder and part of the tiller coming through. Here's another look at it with the ship lines put into it. So piece by piece, we're getting there. We're understanding the ship itself. And then if we overlay that on a ship that's just one generation later, Mary Rose, the famous flagship of Henry VIII in England, you can see that Gripsholden is really a lot smaller than Mary Rose. So there's this rapid development in warships and in artillery on warships just at the end of the 15th century, beginning of the 16th century. So we've got this moment before the ships get bigger and the guns get bigger. So the guns. There were 9 recovered, 9 of the gun beds recovered, made of oak, in 2002, and then we've recovered a couple more since then. And these are really fascinating. You'd say, well, where are the guns? In the Baltic, the iron goes away. So there are anaerobic bacteria that make their living by eating iron. Iron doesn't survive, but the wood, fortunately, for now, does. And the way these gun beds are made, they're hollowed out of the third timber of trees, they're carved, and then they're carved to fit the gun barrel. So because we have really good negative impressions of the guns themselves, we can recreate digitally the gun tubes. So I'll pass around a couple of guns for you to handle. And they've got three pieces there. There's the powder chamber, the gun tube itself, and then the oak bed. And here's another example too. This one we think is a different style. It probably could have been what they call a stone gun, maybe firing stone projectiles. But the other guns fire these, not much smaller than a golf ball, really, 200 to 300 grams. So not ship killers, but anti-personnel weapons. So we've modeled all of the guns now, and here's how it all would have fit together. You can pass that around too. So Gripshunden gives us this look into what warships were like in this critical period. So here are some of those projectiles. We've recovered how many? 3, 4 archaeologically? And then the others have been turned in by the divers who worked on the site. One of them's here, Benny, over the years. Now, these cannonballs, they're lead, but they have an iron core, like an iron die inside. And why they did that, we don't know. But this is the same kind of projectiles that you get from Mary Rose, the same kind of projectiles that are seen on a couple of early 16th century wrecks in the Americas at Molasses Reef and Highborn Key, and the same kind of projectiles that we get on the wreck of Esmeralda in Oman, one of Vasco da Gama's ships. So why they did this, we don't know. Some people speculate it's to save material, as if lead was that expensive. My pet theory is that they were trying to get shrapnel. So when these things strike, the iron core gets sort of kicked out, and it takes little fragments of lead, so you get a shotgun effect. But I don't know. We can't say for sure. You can see the golf ball there. It's smaller than a golf ball. So again, markers of the elite. Not everybody could afford these things. You had to be really, really wealthy. You had to be a king or a very high nobleman to have an artillery carrying ship. Then other markers, silver coins. In 2019, and since, almost every field campaign now where we excavate, we recover a couple of coins. But in 2019, we recovered a lump of coins. This is a 1-to-1 3D print. So it looked just like this, but it was blackened like that. I'll pass that around too. There's a purse of coins. But we knew that they were too fragile, too frangible to separate mechanically. So in order to get information about what was in this stack of coins, we used computed tomography, CT scanning. We did this over in Denmark, and then Gita Ingvardsson, a numismatist and archaeologist who was working at Lunds Historiska Museet, went through all the data and identified the coins. So I'll show you a little movie of the CT scan, and you can see the motif appearing on the coins. Now, if you want to see really, really close up, here are two coins, one from the reign of Christian I and one from Hans, minted in Malmo. These are the kinds of coins that came off of Gripshunden here. In this stack of coins, Gitte was able to identify coins from Malmo, coins from Oslo, the mints that were established when Hans took the crown in 1483 in Norway. So we have the earliest examples of the Norwegian coins, and also coins from Gotland. So it's all from the Danish-Norwegian realm, and it's from multiple kings. It's not just from Hans's reign, it's from Christian I, possibly from Christopher III, and even the interregnum between them. So what it means is that the kings aren't recalling all the coinage when they take the crown. They're not devaluing it. They're not adding more copper to the silver coins. They're just using the coins that are out there. So it tells us something about monetary policy. But also the coins from the different realms, when you look at them really quickly, they look pretty much identical. So the K for Christian looks very, very similar to the H for Hans. And so there's this continuity among the generations that the kings seem to be following. And the other thing, too, is that there's a mix of the low and high culture. So you have the H for Hans, but there's Latin written around it. So it's Danish language and Latin, which is high and low culture, maybe. So I mentioned the clothes. The clothes make the man, is a saying in English, or woman. when Princess Margaret becomes Queen Margaret of Scotland, she's absorbing 20 to 25% of the entire annual budget of Scotland just for her wardrobe. So this really, really matters. And then in 1490, we came across some records from Henry VII, where there's two Danish noblemen who get their ships seized by English pirates. And Henry VII wants to make them right. So he gives them back their ships, but then his reward to them, or his, whatever you want to call it, his restitution to them is scarlet cloth to make these gowns of the style of the nation, as he says, and doublets of satin. So high quality cloth with really, really bling added to your wardrobe. Show off your clothes. 2 shirts even, and hose of colors of your choice. So you can imagine what these guys might have looked like as they pranced around the castles in their finery. So we had one piece of textile that came up in 2019, and here it is. And there was speculation whether this was from 1495 or whether it was some sort of modern intrusion on it. So thankfully, Christopher Sandal, who's the director of Blekinge Museum, who's here tonight, gave permission for us to do a study of it. So we got 2 medieval textile experts to come over from the Danish National Museum. They looked at it under their microscope. They took a couple of fiber samples back for fiber analysis, and then we submitted some for radiocarbon dating too to Lund University. And the radiocarbon date came back 30,000 plus years old. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that it's beyond the range of detection for that type of investigation. It means that this is not linen, it's not cotton, it's not wool, it's polyester made from petrochemicals. So the radiocarbon, the C14 isotope had gone away, and that's why we got that very, very old radiocarbon date. So it's modern trash on the wreck. Benny, do you know anything about this? Okay, just checking. Somebody put it there, it wasn't us. But again, like with the possibility of written documents, there could be clothing down there. There could be chests, there could be boxes of the sailor's clothes or the nobleman's clothes. It's just going to take looking, and we may find it. So, other things that the nobles participate in, gaming, hunting and warfare. It's hard to sort of imagine how much violence and weaponry was a part of everyday life for a nobleman in the late medieval period. So they always are carrying weapons. It's part of their dress. And in fact, we found these so-called ballock daggers that they would hang off of the front of their belts. We found elements of them on the wreck. But also crossbows and handguns, gunpowder weapons, handheld gunpowder weapons to complement the artillery. So both of these things on the wreck at the same time, and you wonder, why didn't they just adopt the guns? Why are they still sticking with the crossbows? Well, if we look to the shooting festivals that were carried out in the German cities in the late 15th century, we have records of who won, of what the distance was on the range, what weapons they were shooting, and how big the targets were. And it turns out that the crossbows are far more accurate than the muskets or handguns at the time. In fact, the crossbows are on a par in accuracy with the same thing you see in biathlon today. Small targets at that same range, very, very close. So these are the weapons with which you sharpshoot. And then the muskets are what you do with massed fire. So if you've got a rank of men, of soldiers out there, you can shoot your muskets and your handguns and hope that you hit somebody. But if you want to take down one particular target, you go with the crossbow. Well, we found these handguns. We found one in 2022, and here's Morgan Olsen from Blekinge Museum holding the stock. Just like the artillery, the iron barrel's gone away, the trigger's gone away, but we can make some really good estimates of what the gun itself looked like just from the wooden stock. And because Gribshunden is such a generous wreck, it gave us two. It gave us 2 different guns, so we have instant comparison. So the same kind of weapon here, just coming back from conservation over in Denmark. And you can see that this one, the stock on it, which would fit under your arm, isn't eroded away, isn't broken off like this one was. Same kinds of weapons. Not wheel lock, probably just a simple tube with a powder a powder tray that you would put a little linstock into with a burning match and light it off, just like a small handheld cannon. But the crossbows are really spectacular. There are crossbows in museums. There's some up in Stockholm for sure, but they don't really have solid dates. We don't know when they were made, when they were used. And like anything in a museum of this kind, it's been reworked, it's been conserved, it's been added on to. So they're not really original. And that's the same throughout Europe in all of the museums. There are crossbows there. Seldom do they have a secure date. Well, on Gripshunden now, we're up to, Christopher, how many? 8, 9? 8 crossbows in this kind of condition. This is the tiller and the nut that would have held the bowstring. And when they came up, they actually had the horn accoutrements, decorations, but functional decorations on them. The bows itself, the prods, are gone, which is another story that I'll get to in a moment. But here is what one of these looks like in situ. This is after, Mika, how many? 3 days, 2 days of excavation, several dive cycles. So here's the tiller of it, and even the lashings that held the prod onto that tiller, the nut and some of those bone or horn functional decorations. And this was down about 1.2 meters, a little less than that, in the excavation trench. So when you get down into the sediments, things are remarkably well preserved. And with them, lots and lots of the arrows, the quarrels. And this is where it gets quite interesting. We had Guy Wilson, who was the former director of the Royal Armoury in the UK, come over. It's really easy to get experts to come visit Gripshunden, which is another indication of just what an important site it is. So Guy Wilson, one of the acknowledged experts on medieval hand weapons, paid his own way to come over. He's been here twice now. And when he saw the arrows, he was delighted, because you just don't get this kind of stuff. Even in the Royal Armories, they don't have it. So this one here is almost certainly a hunting arrow. This could have been hunting, or it could have been fitted with an iron head that would have been good for war. A variety of different arrows, all dated to June 1495, just like the crossbows. And then the strangest thing came up in a couple of different pieces. We think it's a quiver for these arrows, but Guy had never seen anything like it because it's a tripod, or at least a bipod. So not the kind of thing that you would actually hang on your hip when you're out on your horseback, but something that you would place on the ground, or in this case, on the deck maybe, and then you can just draw your arrows out. Guy's never seen anything like this. There's nothing else like this in the world that we know of. This is the sole example. Comes from Gripshunden. So all kinds of new things. I just assumed that when Hans got to Kalmar, he and the nobleman were going to have hunts. And they were maybe setting up like in a tree stand with your tripod quiver right there to draw your arrows out and shoot whatever game it was they were after. So I'll give you something else a little fantastic. In the context with all of these crossbows and all of these arrows, this is a small trench. It was 2 by 3 meters where we were excavating in 2021. We found these pieces of birch bark. Now, there's plenty of bark down there because there's lots of firewood on the wreck. But the birch bark was something else. And so when I saw this, it looked to me like there was some sort of pattern on it. So we kept going back to it. We'd excavate a little more. We'd go back to it. We're trying to bring all the sediment levels down steadily, carefully. And here's another one. So 2 of them, spaced less than a meter apart in the trench. This one was beautiful. It hadn't oxidized, so it's still that bright sort of golden color. Slowly, took us a while. Everything's careful. Everything's documented. We're all wearing video cameras so we can document every moment of the excavation. There, finally pulled it out. The crossbows, before they had the steel prods, the steel bows, they had composite prods. So they were made of wood and sinew, organic material from animals, and they were glued together with an organic glue. To keep them waterproof, they were wrapped in birch bark, and often the birch bark was elaborately decorated. And that's what we think we've got here. In the bottom right, there's a peacock. So here's one example from Andreas Bickler down in Austria of the pattern that he put on a composite prod of a crossbow in a museum. It's a replica. But not just a peacock, a unicorn. And it almost looks gilded here. When we took it out, we weren't sure if it was birch bark or leather. Well, the unicorn, of course, is a common motif, religious motif, and something commonly seen in artwork throughout the medieval world, all over the continent, even up here. And of course, the coin of James III and James IV was called a unicorn because the unicorn is part of the Scottish king's heraldic symbol. So possibly there's a link there back to Scotland. Maybe not, hard to say. But there's unicorns on the Danish churches. There's a unicorn in the Lund Cathedral, in fact. So they're everywhere. But we wanted to see the entire motif. So the Humanities Lab at Lund University has a lab set up where you could do reflectance transformation imaging, where you basically shine a light from oblique angles and record every image, and then the computer spits you out sort of a dynamic image. So you can change the shadows and lighting. We passed all this data over to Sol Halsted at the Danish National Museum, who's an illustrator, and this is the motif. So you have a rose, the unicorn, a lion rampant, a peacock, and then on the far right there's a stag with a sort of incised T between his antlers. There's no up or down to this. You know, they're offset 90 or 100 degrees from each other, but here's what they looked like there. And then all along the outside, there's a series of other animals and birds. It's a forest scene. There's no sea creatures here. So we haven't quite deciphered the entire motif, but the number of birds and the variety of species, it gives us a little bit of a auditory imagination into the medieval world. The forest must have been much denser. There must have been so many more birds. You can imagine walking around in 1495, and it's just a chorus of bird song all the time. So a curious thing that you might not think you'd find on a shipwreck, a little hint about what it sounded like in this part of the world 500 years ago. There's nothing else like this. Again, we have this problem where we can't compare it to anything. No one has medieval birch bark artwork, secular artwork especially. So it's something special. And 2 panels, pressure printed, and they're identical. They're 330 by 110 millimeters, both of them. Maybe these wrapped both ends of a prod. Maybe they were decoration on a box or something. Hard to imagine they would decorate a wooden box because you think we'd find the wood. Impossible to imagine they'd decorate, say, a silver box, because why would you cover silver with bark? So kind of a mystery. But wood stays well preserved. The bark does, but also the wooden casks. And this is a little bit of an insight, too, into the medieval world. Nowadays, everything comes in standard liters, standard measures all across the European Union. Well, that's a trend that started back in the 15th century, maybe even earlier, when the different trading cities were desperately trying to standardize the volumes of the things that were being shipped around. Because you can't ship bulk unless you know how much you've got. You can't take time to measure every cask to see how much is in it. So Rostock, for instance, in the 14th century, was trying to standardize the herring barrels, the sill barrels from the fishery down in Falsterbo and Skåne. So this is a trend that continues, and it's hard work. How do you gauge it? You have to have go, no-go gauging. You have to have someone actually monitoring this whole thing. But it's all an insight into into the political economy of the time. And the stuff that's inside, of course, is what Hans was taking to feast on. So we assume a lot of beer, different kinds. But one of the casks had these orange things in it. It turns out they were the scutes and bones of a sturgeon, about 2 meters long. So sturgeon, of course, an ancient species, a fascinating fish. In medieval Denmark, there was a thing called the beach law, where anything on the seacoast that was more than one man's burden belonged to the king. So you think whales and that kind of stuff. Sturgeon was especially held out as something belonging to the king. So if you poached a salmon, it was a capital offense. So Hans here has this sturgeon in a cask. He's taking to Kalmar. It's a way for him to show off with the royal fish, we think. So we did ancient DNA analysis of this and analysis of the bones itself, and we determined that it's a species that was present here in the Baltic. It probably didn't come from anywhere else. It was locally caught, we think. And it makes me wonder if we could ever possibly reintroduce sturgeon to the Baltic. And then there's small things. The comb made of boxwood to comb your hair, but also to get rid of the body lice. We have several pieces of shoes and this wonderful tankard. There's a 3D print of it in the other room in nylon again, so you can hand it all around. Emblazoned with possibly a royal symbol, maybe not. Here we are excavated. Mika and I were the excavators here when we found this. So there's a wooden plate down here. There's a wicker basket here. There's a small, heavy cask next to it, which I think possibly could have been a gunpowder cask. And then right in between was this tankard. And you see in the right-hand image, when we cleared the sediment away, it started to float up to the surface. And the reason it did that was the cap was still on it, the cover was still on it, and it was full of the gas that was the decomposition products of whatever beverage was in there in June of 1495. Possibly beer, who knows. But I had to tip that gas out to make it be negatively buoyant, because otherwise it was going to shoot up to the surface without us. So there's the bubbles coming out of there. And it's this direct connection back to that calamitous moment when there's an explosion on the ship, and whoever's drinking this beer just drops it and dies or gets off the ship. So was it the king's vessel? Hard to say. The king's cup, I mean, we've got this fine example of the Oldenboy horn over in Rosenborg Castle, which Christian I brought back from his trip down to see the Pope. Now, probably he never drank out of something this fine, but somewhere in between the wooden tankard and the Oldenboy horn is probably what the king was drinking out of. Maybe we'll find more. And then the most exotic. Again, nothing else like this has been found ever before in archaeology. Peppercorns, we got about 2,000 peppercorns. They came up, the first ones came up in that mesh bag, the catch bag on the dredge, because they just look like sediment down there. You know what a peppercorn looks like. They're very small. But we started to see them in the mesh bag, and Marie, I think it was, said, "Oh, we've got peppercorns here." And then ginger root. We got more than 60 pieces of fresh ginger root, which I don't think was growing here. There weren't any greenhouses in the 15th century. And then a series of other exotic spices. Clove, 300 pieces of clove, 300 almonds, black mustard, caraway, dill, hops, a little bit of henbane, which is a hallucinogen, can be a really nasty hallucinogen, but it's also the same thing that's been synthesized to make scopolamine patches for motion sickness. So maybe that's what they were using it for. Maybe it's just happened to be in there among all the other botanicals. We don't know. And grape and cucumber, hazelnut, all kinds of things that are really uncommon. And most of these spices just aren't ever found archaeologically. But since it's Lucia, we have to get over to the saffron. Mika and Marie Janssen were excavating, and they came up and they said, "We found something red down there." I was like, "Was it rust?" They said, "No, looks like saffron." And I thought, "What?" And they gave me a little bag full of saffron. So here's the discovery and recovery of saffron from the wreck. And not just a little bit, not just one concentration, 2, 3, I don't know how many concentrations we ended up with. But ultimately, it's something around 400 or 500 milliliters of saffron. Just sitting there in lumps on the seafloor. Not in a vessel, not in a bag, not in a box. That's about half of it. So I always joke, Lucia, we've got our saffron cake, got our saffron buns. Right there. That's where it started. The Swedes want to emulate King Hans. So, I said that the wood is well preserved because in the Baltic, with our low salinity and low temperatures, the shipworm, Teredo nivalis, can't survive, can't propagate. That's why we have so many glorious shipwrecks. That's why we have Vasa. That's why we have Gribshunden. 2 weeks ago, there was an article in Sydsvenskan. I don't know if anybody saw it, but all of a sudden, the shipworm is here, and it's eating all of the pilings in Malmö. So they checked these pilings 6 years ago, nothing. They checked them again just now, they've all been eaten through. So the shipworm is marching into the Baltic. We don't know how far it's going to spread, we don't know how quickly it's going to spread, but it's here. And it very well may work its way over here to Blekinge. We just don't know. But there's a new peril out there. So how does that affect Gribshunden? Well, I'm not sure yet, but we need to have a serious conversation with Länsstyrelsen and figure out what they're going to allow us to do, because all of a sudden now it feels like the clock is ticking, and we may lose what's down there. I'm going to pass around 2 more objects. These are the hawse pieces that were on either side of the stem post. This is what the anchor lines run through up at the front of the ship. And I'm going to have you feel the thickness of this. This is the port side, the left side. This is the starboard side. This one was down in the sediments. These are big pieces of oak, again, 1 to 10 scale. So these are 2-meter long pieces of oak that are very, very heavy. And we 3D modeled them underwater with photogrammetry. We didn't recover them because they're massive. But you feel the difference in them. One's much thicker. The starboard side's much thicker because, like I said, the ship's listing 27 degrees to starboard. So the port side one was up higher in the water column, closer to the sunlight, closer to any whatever wave action there is in a protected anchorage. But you can feel the difference. So what we're doing with our studies is it's not just making models. We're not just making sketch fab models to put online of these wreck sites. We're understanding from the modeling site formation processes and construction of the ship itself. So there's a lot of information that's derived from everything we do, and we're really very, very conscious about impacting the site as little as we possibly can to extract the maximum information from it. And then we get to do things like hand these around so you can actually touch the wreck in a way that's impossible otherwise. When we lifted these things out of the sediments to put them on trestles to do the 3D modeling, they are so heavy. So it's nice to be able to handle them at scale. So what's next? Well, if Länsstyrelsen will allow it, I think the thing to do is to trench right across the midship section. Try to expose the main mast step. Dig down through the ballast and expose the floors of the ship and get a proper midship section so that we can fill in the rest of this reconstruction of the vessel style. The midship section is also where we got a big metal detection hit, where we think the cook stove is. We know there's a stove. We've got loads and loads of firewood. This would be, I think, the earliest galley on a European ship ever found. So that would be interesting. And then the foodways, the spices, the other things that were being consumed by the elite, by the king, by the nobility, but also by the officers on the ship and by the sailors and maybe if there were mercenaries on board. If we can get that range of foodstuffs, I think it would be completely instructive about social hierarchy in the late medieval period. So that's what I think we should do next. But if we do this, it means moving deck beams. It means probably thousands of artifacts. which then Christopher and Stefan have to deal with at Blekinge Museum. So we have to have a big budget because conservation is really, really costly. But the return on investment, the money that we would put into this, I think would be insignificant to the amount of information, the new knowledge that we can get from the wreck. So I'll leave it there and hopefully we have some questions. Thank you.
Så. Tusen tack. Hörs jag nu? Lite grann. Frågor? Så det bara snurrar här. Och det var så mycket information så att ni kanske har fått all information i.
It's like trying to get a sip of water out of a fire hose.
En fråga.
Jag dök där i början på 70-talet och då fick jag näven full av revben. Kompisarna sa det var skeppsgrisen. Och det hittade jag från uppkomna.
When he dived, he said he found ribs that he said were from pigs, or could that be human ribs? Have you found any?
We found ribs from pig and cattle. There could be human remains. We haven't seen any yet. But the written sources say there was an explosion. Some of them say a fire, but it's Sture Kroniken that says that there's this huge fire. And of course, Sten Sture was all about propaganda. But certainly an explosion. Something sank the ship. I think that it's likely that when Hans came up here to Ronneby, they anchored over there. Hans leaves the ship. And then the sailors are getting busy doing tasks. And they're down below decks. Even though it's midsummer, it's dark below decks. So they have to have illumination. And the only illumination is by candle in a lantern. So you've got more or less open flame below decks on the first generation of ship carrying gunpowder. So if there's an explosion, it probably isn't blowing the ship apart, maybe. It's probably enough that the pressure wave springs the planks and then there's uncontrollable flooding. And if that's the case, if there's men down below decks with this flame who create this explosion, they died, absolutely. So will we find their remains? Maybe. We'll see.
Inte än.
Did you get that, Benny? Yeah, okay.
Fler funderingar? Det var mycket information.
Yeah. Some of the gun carriages in 2002 came from off here. And off to the west, I guess it is, there's a long, I think it's a spar. I saw it in 2019. I haven't been back there because we're so focused really on the tasks that we've been allowed to do by Lance Thurlson that we don't stray a whole lot. But there are things out. So actually, I've been trying to estimate how much we've excavated, how much of the area and the volume of the wreck we've actually disturbed. And it's tough to say because, I mean, there's this sort of the inner part of the wreck, but there's debris spread out over a much, much larger area.
Flera funderingar?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the things I've been in touch with Fred Hawker up at Vasamuseet to learn about the steering gear on Vasa, which of course is much later. But we don't know. It's not a wheel, right? It could be a whipstaff. So that's part of what we were looking for when we recovered this element, the connections to the extension to this piece, and then what would have gone up to the helmsman's deck. And we don't know yet. So one or two probably handling the actual steering. But on ships like this, most of the steering is done with the sails. So the rudder helps a little bit, but it's really changing those yards to get you in the right direction.
Depending on the wind.
Yeah.
Är vi nöjda så? Där var en fråga till. Vi tar den här, annars hör inte de som sitter hemma nämligen.
Thank you. What about the financing of new archaeological excavations? Are there financing from national level or Danish funds?
That's the
So-
question, yeah. I mean,
Thank
part of the reason I was recruited into this in 2018 was to help raise money. Because before I came in, there was not a single external kroner put in, dollar, I keep kicking back to that. Not a single external kroner put into it. It was an all-volunteer team that was going out. Since I've come aboard now, we've raised over 10 million kroner from grants from Crawford Foundation, largely. Blekinge Museum has put in a lot of resources, time and money. Ronneby Commune has contributed some funding to help the general effort too. But the next step is more grant proposals. So we need to find out from Landstyrelsen what they're going to allow. Because I have a grand vision for this. I see how this relates not just to the history of Sweden and Denmark, but how this is really a site of global importance. So I think a Horizon Europe proposal should go in, which necessarily means at least 3 nations and 3 institutions from those nations. Those are sort of 3 to 5 million euro over about 3 years. But it's a much bigger project. There's Riksbanken Jubileum Fund. They provided, I think it was 36 million crown for a multi-year project to document what they're calling the lost Navy, the Ghost Fleet. But that's making models of hulls around the Swedish Baltic. But those are 2 places. Crawford is another place we could go back to. And I'm always raising money in the United States. So before I came here, most of my funding was from American sources. And I still have some of those connections with wealthy individuals and with foundations in the States. But it's all a matter of finding the right source. And the problem we've had here is that this is a Danish ship. So Sweden isn't particularly interested. Now, this was Denmark then, but it's Sweden now. And the political power and cultural power in this country now is in the 08 phone area code. It's Stockholm. So trying to get the attention of people in Stockholm for something down here in Blekinge is not easy. On the other hand, the Danes say that this ship dates before the founding of the Danish Navy. So they're not that interested in it, and besides, it's in Sweden. So, I mean, I think we kind of needed somebody, an outsider. I mean, I'm a Swedish citizen now, but I think we kind of needed someone who wasn't Danish or wasn't Swedish to come in and say, hey, wake up, this is a really important site. Let's do it justice.
Ja, vi har mycket att göra, både jag och Brandon och många andra. Vi tackar där. Och sen så skulle jag också vilja säga tack till Blekinge Museum för det här är samordnat ikväll och till Gripsundens vänner som har bidragit med fikat. Så en applåd.
Ja, tack. Tack.